So first off, I think it could be important for us to kind of help people understand what an encyclical is for those who don't know. So if you could kind of just briefly explain what an encyclical is and maybe why it's important.
Laudato Si, the latest encyclical from Pope Francis, is the highest level of teaching that the Church has without invoking ex cathedra, which would be something that is infallible from the Pope, or the teachings that come from a council. So this is the highest kind of teaching that the Pope has in the form of a papal letter. So we look at other encyclicals that have come down to us through the centuries, and they have been incredibly impactful. Rerum Novarum is a great example. One Pacem in Terris would be another wonderful example of a papal encyclical. Pacem in Terris talked about the very controversial topic at the time, nuclear proliferation. The encyclical model that Pope Francis is using is really very instructive just in how he lays it out. So how Laudato Si, the very instruction is also offered in the setup of the letter. So the way he moves through the chapters of this particular encyclical. Many popes down through the centuries have used the encyclical model. The other thing that's really interesting about this particular encyclical is the fact that since John the 23rd, this is the only time a papal encyclical has been addressed not just to Catholics around the world, but he addresses it to people of goodwill. So he's addressing the whole human community, people of various religious backgrounds. So it's not just to Catholics as most encyclicals are addressed. So there are some things that are very unique and instructive about the very structure of the document with Laudato Si that makes it such an interesting form of teaching.
And with this most recent encyclical, what would you say is kind of the essential theme to take away? I know that can be difficult to get it down to a brief phrase, but from your opinion, what is just the general idea?
So if I were to invite people to read a single chapter, I would invite them simply to read chapter 4 of the encyclical, where Pope Francis talks specifically about integral ecology. And that integral ecology is a look at a new understanding of the level of interdependence that we have as a communion of subjects around the earth, and our interconnectedness and interrelatedness and interdependence upon one another. There, at the end of that chapter, there is a paragraph, and I think it's 161 actually, but I'll have to check. I can get back to you on that. But the paragraph that ends that 4th chapter is a paragraph that asks a series of questions. And it's basically a delving into looking at our responsibility as well as taking the anthropocentrism, the human-centered approach to questions of ecology, and placing that front and center, saying that because of our anthropocentrism, we have gotten ourselves into the ecological devastation and struggles that we have around the earth. And he pointedly goes after that kind of anthropocentrism as a way of engaging the human person and trying to impel us into a response. So I would say read the whole encyclical. It's not that long, and it's actually written in a very readable format. But if you have to focus on one specific chapter, I would focus on the 4th chapter. If you can't do a whole chapter, do the end of the 4th chapter.
From my understanding, the Pope also talks about the social culture of consumerism. And so I was wondering how the Pope kind of relates our social culture of consumerism to how that affects the environment.
Okay. It's a fantastic question, and it shows that you've clearly done some reading about this document. He specifically goes after the question of consumerism and the question of a capitalist structure, which will make many people very uncomfortable. Because what he is saying is that the consumption that we participate in as human beings has a disproportionate impact on those who have least in the world. So if we are taking constantly from the developing world, for example, where people don't have the power, the position, or the privilege in order to respond as we do in the first world, then that there is a disproportionate impact, and those are the patterns that get established that keep people locked in the situation of poverty. It is very difficult to break out of that structure. And with what he calls in the encyclical a throwaway culture, the planned obsolescence of something which I'm sure you have in your pocket, a cell phone, and you think, well, I need the latest cell phone. And Sprint's offering a deal right now where you can get a new iPhone every year that a new iPhone comes out for $15 extra a month on your plan, right? I was just reading the New York Times this morning. And it's that kind of throwaway culture where we take things that were at one time a privilege, right, to have, and they become so de rigueur, so much a part of our daily lives, that we say that I couldn't possibly live without my phone. Well, I did just fine living without a cell phone until I was 28 years old because cell phones weren't around. And when I was in college, cell phones were about this big and they looked like a brick with a big black antenna coming out of the top of them. So we now take something like that and we wouldn't dream of having that as our phone, right? But the throwaway culture says, well, we need the latest, the greatest, the phone with the best features, right? And when you look around this university campus, he's saying that culture of throwaway and consumerist culture has alienated us from one another because it's making the human person the center of things, and that the goods and services of the earth are meant to serve the human person who is at the center. And he's saying that when that happens, we have a breakdown of the interdependence of all of humanity, of all of creation, and we see ourselves as separate rather than integral part. What he is really pointing to is a reality that the human person is derivative of creation, not primary. And when I say derivative, we have to remember that the universe and the cosmos has been unfolding for nearly 14 billion years. And that we have come along only in these last few seconds. If you put that unfolding on a 24-hour clock, we arrive at like 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. And yet we have placed ourselves in the center. And we have made ourselves primary, not derivative of creation. And when we do that, we take and treat creation as if it is to serve our needs. And what the Holy Father is saying is we've got that backwards.
And so understanding how that throwaway culture affects maybe the marginalized in society and, like you said, makes them kind of stay where they're at. And then also how that kind of treats us as not derivative of creation, but as the purpose of creation. What is it that Pope Francis calls us to really see or to really change about that?
Well, the first is he wants us to change how we understand ourselves in relationship to the rest of creation. And he lifts up the poor, particularly in the encyclical, and he is focused intently on how is this impacting those with the least amount of power. He uses a very controversial example of drugs being produced in the third world. And he indicts a first world culture that is using illegal substances. And he's saying, now let's look at the incredible violence that perpetuates. And he's clearly coming as a Latin American bishop before he was made pope. He's looking at the extensive drugs that are produced in Latin America and saying, what's the impact on those who are held in a kind of bondage through the production of illegal drugs that are then consumed by the first world nations? We use this nation as an example, the US, and to say, how is our consumption forcing and keeping in bondage those who have the least power to assert control or autonomy in their own lives. Let's look at something a little less controversial. Dinner. When we eat dinner in this country, many times the plate that we have has foods not just from within 100 miles or 200 miles, but sometimes thousands of miles. The flowers on our table, likely grown in Colombia and shipped to the United States, right? And because that is where the labor can be most exploited. That is where the labor is cheapest. Those strawberries that are fresh that we have with our, strawberry shortcake that are totally out of season are probably coming from somewhere in Chile, right? Or perhaps somewhere else in South America. And so when we start to think, and what the Holy Father is trying to have us imagine is, what are the impacts of our habits as a first world nation on that kind of consumption, on not just the foods that we eat, but how we have fun, how and where we take vacations, how we spend our money, what we use, and at the same time, how we ourselves generate our own income, to recognize that the production of certain goods and services are directly the result of exploitation of those who have the least power to change those structures.
Do you know, or can you think of any specific changes that Pope Francis might want college students to seek after? In particular, college students like Regis at a Jesuit university, and as Pope Francis is a Jesuit, is there a way that Pope Francis calls us college kids to kind of act regarding this encyclical?
Absolutely. So he uses the example again and again throughout the encyclical of water. Okay? When I go in to the cafeteria on this campus, or I go to the local convenience store and I buy bottled water, it's a classic example of something to be able to say, if I'm going to buy bottled drinks, if I just take that one bottled water, it takes almost 13 gallons of water to make the plastic, to go through all the procedures and shipping that water and transporting it and getting it to you so that you have that 12 or 14 ounces of water in that quick throwaway container that you can run to class with because you didn't have time or you forgot your portable Nalgene bottle, right? Or your Regis water bottle. So something as simple as saying, can you, with your fellow students and with the student government here and with the administration, can you make this a plastic-free campus, like a plastic bottle-free campus? What would it be like instead of freshmen getting t-shirts, yet another t-shirt that says, class of 2019, right? Is that where we are now? Yeah. That what if they were received a metal water bottle? What if they received a water bottle made out of recycled material? What if that water bottle had some reminders of how they could live more sustainably? What if there were something else that's simple? What if there was a timer in the shower? How many people go into the showers in the dorms and they relax by just standing under hot water pouring all over them for half an hour, right? How many students do loads of laundry that aren't a full load because, well, I'm not going to wash my clothes with my roommate's clothes because I only have half a load, right? I'm just going to go ahead and do a load of laundry. So it's more about being intentional about using our minds, our hearts, our whole selves to say, how can we act with a longer view in mind of the impacts of the things, the habits that we have developed. And Pope Francis particularly highlights the use of water. My generation has fought over oil for as long as I can remember. Your generation is going to fight over water. It's already happening in parts of our world. When we look at a country like Bolivia, where the water rights have caused deaths of hundreds. But water is a prime example of something you can look at right here in your own campus's use. What would it be like to have gardens that didn't require constant sprinklers to go on? What if you let the grass on the green die off at certain times of the year. Does it have to be green all the time? You know? So it's looking at what are our assumptions that we are going to have this limitless supply of water. We know that the Arapahoe Basin and the Arapahoe water table is being depleted at such a rate that it's not going to be able to recharge in time to continue the consumptive patterns that Denver as a city is using it.
On a different note, I find that people often have trouble connecting spirituality with, say, like the environment or how we should act towards the environment. But I think Pope Francis tries to connect those in the encyclical, and I think you've alluded to it a little bit already, but if you could maybe expand on the relationship between spirituality and how we should act towards our environment.
Absolutely. I don't think Pope Francis tries. I think he does it very successfully in the encyclical. But let me ask you a question as a way of answering your question. If I asked you to recall a time in your life where you felt a presence of the divine, you're going to tell me a story, I'm guessing, about the natural world. So you tell me a story. Is there some memory that you have where you were felt awed or inspired or you felt that divine presence? Can you think of one?
The moment that immediately comes to mind is a camping trip that I went on with my grandfather and my two brothers in northern Minnesota. And there's no lights, no cities. We're out in the open on an island in the middle of a lake, just enjoying the sunset and enjoying the night sky and the serene beauty experienced in that, and experienced in communion with my grandpa and my two brothers. I still remember to this day as kind of just that feeling of God's presence in the world.
Excellent. And I'll bet you if I were to add a soundtrack to that memory that you're telling me about, I'll bet you there would be loons singing in the background somewhere, because those lakes are known for the loons that come there and nest in the summer, right? If we can imagine that haunting call of that loon and the beautiful and sort of disarming irony of the fact that it was in darkness and to the cover of night that you were able to see. It wasn't this bright, beautiful day, but it was quite literally in darkness that you were able to see the light of the divine. For how many centuries have people been writing about the stars and how the stars teach us to wonder and how the stars lift our minds and our hearts to something greater than ourselves? And suddenly we have a feeling that, well, maybe we aren't so significant after all. Somehow the stars and the whole cosmos unfolding before us puts us back in our proper place. That, I think, is a wonderful place of beginning. When we begin to understand that the divine is mediated through creation, and that the ecological vision that Pope Francis is inviting us into, and ecological spirituality, is directly connected with what we believe. As a Catholic priest, as a Jesuit, I hold central the teaching of the Incarnation, that God, in the person of Jesus, becomes part of the carbon-based reality of earth. That God bled and sweat and shat upon the earth, right? That God participated in the person of Jesus in the reality of earth, of this creation. And that some of the oxygen that you're breathing in right now and some of the atoms that compose you in the course of your lifetime are atoms that have been of molecules that have been absorbed by Christ himself. Because we live in a confined system, right? So if we are in a closed system, that we know that we share the very same molecules that participated in Christ's time when he was here on the earth. And when we start thinking about the fact that the water you drink or the material that is absorbed into your body and the cells that are replaced, you know, that the water we drink was once dinosaur pee. You know, it's marvelous. And right away we kind of laugh when I say something like that. But it's helpful to see and to start with the great mystery of the incarnation as a point of departure for us in understanding spirituality. Because the incarnation says God desires to participate in creation. And in that participation, God sanctifies, makes holy all of creation. Not just the dirt or the stars that teach us so easily about who God is, but we, our very selves, and the animals that, that delight us and often, intrigue us. So what we believe as Christians, what I believe as a Catholic Jesuit priest, is that fundamental truth that God participated in the world. Not just as creator, like a great clockmaker setting things in motion and letting it unfold, but as a creator that participates in the very forming of who we are and breathing of breath into our lungs. So then we understand a little bit more of the divine when we say how the natural world has inspired us. And I've asked this question to hundreds of people, and they tell me these great stories of, one of my favorites is star stomping. Star stomping is to go to a beach at night, particularly along the equator or in a warm ocean, and your feet, as they impact the little bit of water on the sand at night, will make that phosphorescence glow just for a second. And it looks like a scattering of light or a scattering of stars under your feet. And here are these stars that you talked about in that northern Minnesota lake, right? Suddenly the stars that are in the heavens inspiring you, those stars are at your feet. What is it about the ocean at night that makes us think of the divine? What is it about being on top of a mountain all alone that makes us think of the divine? What is it about the intrigue of a thunderstorm and the power of that makes us think of the majesty and the awe of God? Well, we believe God is creator, and we are creatures, and thus we are in relationship.
It seems to me that what you're saying is necessary is kind of moving away from this thinking of, me, and the self-centered nature, and kind of having a more humble approach to the world so that we're even able to experience all of these great things that God works through rather than just thinking constantly about ourselves. Is that a fair understanding?
That's not only fair, it's very accurate. It's the very word that Pope Francis is using that you describe so well, which is anthropocentrism, right? Placing the human being at the center. But you use another word too that's perfect, humility. It comes from the root of the word that means where we get humus from. And that's the root of the earth, is where that word humility comes from. The very root of the word tells us what it means, to be of the earth. There is a way that our Jesuit schools are often very proud in everything that they've accomplished. And I think that becomes our Achilles heel. That what is needed is a kind of humility to understand that we are entering in this one moment of this 14 billion year history of the great unfolding of the cosmos. And if we can start to see that we are just that much of a flash in this great unfolding of a cosmos, then maybe we're not so central as we thought we were. And if we as Jesuit schools and as Jesuit educators, as a Jesuit myself, and I say that gets at the core struggle I think that Francis is trying to uncover. And what he's trying to uncover with focusing on humility is that our pride becomes our downfall. What if instead of being proud of our schools and our accomplishments, what if instead of pride we were grateful? And saying, I'm grateful that all this has been given to me. I'm grateful for my education. Not I'm proud of my degree, right? Because gratitude has a way of joining strength to strength and to say that I can be more impactful if I see myself working collaboratively with others. So the kind of humility that Francis is inviting is something that goes right to the core struggle of humanity, which is our pride. And what if we were, instead of being proud of all that we have done, what if we were grateful for all that God was able to do through us?
If everybody was able to take Pope Francis's call for acting in the environment and having a humble nature, what do you think the impact of that would be?
Oh my gosh. It's fun to just imagine. I mean, to delight in the fact that we could see ourselves, if we could just get that one notion in our minds and in our hearts and in our inspirations, that we are not the center, that we are a part of something so much greater. If we could get that idea of the common good that Francis is talking about so many times throughout the encyclical, because the common good invites us to do something that is right and just and true, simply because it's right and true and just, not because it benefits us in any way. What we look at as human persons in the capitalist structure, in the socialized as we are in the context of the United States, we want to choose what benefits us most, right? And we say, well, of course that, how does this benefit me? What if we did what is right and good simply because it's right and good? And we didn't care who got the credit for it. And Francis is offering another way of looking at the environmental crisis and the ecological crisis that is saying, for so many years we've been hearing this wagging finger saying, if we continue down this path, we're doomed, right? And he calls those doomsayers, right, those prophets of doom, he calls them on the carpet and says, no, this is not about being about doom and gloom. He's saying this is about the fact that we understand that we are engaged with one another. We are in relationship with one another. And I want to do what is right because I take seriously that relationship that I have with part of an integral ecological vision that he is outlining. And that's why I said that fourth chapter is so key, because that's where he outlines that integral ecology.
And with Pope Francis's vision, is his vision different than past church teachings, or does it expand upon past church teachings, or is it completely different from past church teachings?
He has a wonderful way. You can tell that Pope Francis is the quintessential educator. His own education in the Society of Jesus, his own teaching of science and his study of science. But he uses, as I said, the very structure of the document to teach us about how we are related to one another. But he is not doing something in isolation. He is building on the teachings of the church that have gone and come to us through documents like Gaudium et Spes or Rerum Novarum or Pacem in Terris or other social encyclicals. When he addresses the encyclical to the whole world community, he's following the example of his predecessor, John the 23rd. When he uses the invitation to call into question the difference between what is a right and what is an absolute right, when he's talking about property. And he's saying that property is not, there's a difference between a legal right and an absolute right. And he's saying that property is not an absolute right. An absolute right would be the right to live, right? So if we look at those, what he's doing is he's building on the traditions of those social encyclicals in particular that have come before. So this social understanding of how we engage things like economic structures, political structures, cultural structures, and saying that what we can learn from, but then he's doing something very different at the end by holding up the earth and our derivative relationship with the earth, then he's saying that there's something new here. And he talks about the earth as the text of creation that is teaching us. So he's using age-old teaching of the church to illumine something new. For centuries, the church would hold up scripture and tradition as the two great sources of teaching. The scriptures come from the Bible and the traditions that have been practiced down through the ages. Francis is holding up something that goes back to Augustine and some other church fathers, but hasn't been, including Thomas Aquinas, that hasn't been emphasized in quite some time, and that is the book of creation. That if we were to eliminate a species in the Congo or in the Amazon rainforest, right, boom, there goes that species, it's gone. What would it be like if we tore out the whole book of the Psalms out of every single Bible that it was ever produced. We no longer have the beauty of the Psalms, so they're gone. And if we take and get rid of one creature, then the book of creation is diminished by that creature's presence on the earth. It's a fascinating way of looking at understanding the book of creation that's unfolding before us, and that there is instruction that we are to gain from looking and studying creatures. An example that I love to use is those windmills are proliferating all over the West, right? There's this huge proliferation of using wind energy. Well, many designers, engineers of those giant turbines that you see in those huge windmills, the biomimicry that is happening in the blades of those giant windmills, they look remarkably like the fins of whales. And when I say biomimicry, we're looking at how the natural world deals with problems to say, oh, we can actually learn something about aerodynamics by studying the fins of blue whales. And the similarities that we see in what we are doing to produce energy by saying we can learn a great deal. And Francis is applying those same kind of principles. We take what we know, and it's not saying I'm doing something entirely new, but saying how does our understanding of the ecological crisis need both the teaching and the tradition, as well as the scientific reasoning brought together to see a new way forward, and especially a new way forward for the poor and the most vulnerable of the earth. And the poor of the earth includes the earth itself, because the earth itself is hemorrhaging right now.
Given all the injustices in our current world, why does Pope Francis see this as the issue to write about in an encyclical?
Let me ask you a question as a way of answering again. How long do you think you'd live if you didn't have access to water?
Not very long.
Just a couple of days,
yeah.
right? You know, the human person can survive maybe 5 or 7 days. Your tongue would get as big as a truck. Your lips would shrivel up. Your nose would begin to sink and collapse. We know that water is the critical issue of our time. We know that because we are already experiencing it, that climate change is causing refugees and displacement of peoples around the earth. We know the severity of drought and how it's impacting Australia, for example, or how it's impacting different parts with the desertification of parts of Africa. We know the impacts that that's having on the earth, but we have refused to change our behavior. But water is one of the central issues, because if we don't have water for 7 days, we die. And yet we know that water is being privatized around the earth faster than, and commodified faster than any other commodity on the earth right now. It's a $450, $500 billion industry, you know, that rivals the military industrial complex and those kinds of profits right now. When we look at the largest water commodifiers right now, and those corporations, we look at Suez, we look at Thames, we look at Vivendi, all of these water companies and different companies that are operating around the earth, and the way that major corporations are buying up access to potable water. If I had a tablespoon in my hand and a gallon of water, and the gallon of water was all of the water of the earth, right? Can you imagine this gallon jug right here? And in this tablespoon, that would be all the potable water of the earth. So this is all the water of the earth, and if I were to take 1 tablespoon, there it goes. That's all of the potable water on the earth gone, just like that. And yet we know that if we don't have water, we as a species will die. So the question then becomes, as we privatize water, is water then only available and accessible to those with resources, with money? The debate that's going on in Southern California right now in the California drought is, if I can pay for the water for my swimming pool, then I should be able to have it. Well, when people don't have access to any water, do you think that that is right? Isn't there something unjust about that structure? And if water is privatized, then it says that only those who can afford the water can get the water. So then is water a right or a privilege? Because if it's a privilege, then there is no such thing as the common good. Then there is no justice for those who don't have access to that privilege. But the way it becomes a privilege is by buying and selling water on the international market, which is already happening. We can't commodify the air as easily, but we can commodify access to potable water in particular. And that's what's happening at a rate, and that's why your generation is going to fight over water rights, just like my generation fought over access to energy and oil resources.
So do you think that this encyclical will have a long-standing impact, say, in the next 100 years or even 500 years? Do you think that people will remember this encyclical as maybe a turning point, or at least a reminder and an urge to really rethink how we view our Earth and how we view the environment?
My students never cease to inspire me. I've taught for many, many years, and the things that they are able to come up with where I say back to them, wow, just wow. I never would have thought of that. I was in a class one time where we were talking about how we would save energy in terms of redesigning tanks that were on the side of a river. And one of the students had this very simple idea of, well, what if we just painted the tank a different color so that it wasn't dark, so that it was white and began to reflect back that light and heat energy to automatically cool the contents of that tank. Another student said, what if we just pumped a little river water with a little electric pump over the top of that tank, and that water washed over the tank, went through some filtrations, and then went back into the stream? I'm amazed at the things that they come up with that are energy savings. What Pope Francis offers us in this encyclical is a new way of imagining problems, just like my students come up with new ways of imagining how we might deal with something as simple as cooling a tank that is, near a water source. That same kind of innovation is what is such a hallmark of this ecological encyclical Laudato Si. Praise be, or blessed be, right? And he takes those words from the very beginning of St. Francis of Assisi's song and his mantra, right? Where he is blessing creation. And everyone, all the popes before him who have written encyclicals know that the first words of the encyclical will be given as the name of that encyclical. The popularity of St. Francis of Assisi and how we see him in gardens and statues of him everywhere, everybody loves Francis because Francis is all about the animals and the earth. And Pope Francis chose that name very deliberately. That is not lost on those of us who have been watching carefully what Francis has been doing in setting up this encyclical. So in short, yes, I believe there will be a huge and lasting impact because he's not only giving us a response, he's setting up the very pattern in the encyclical itself of how to engage those social problems that we have. He begins with the data. He begins with a statement of the problem. And then he looks at the scientific impacts of climate change or of access to water. And then he takes us through a process that has been known in Jesuit education for over 450 years. And it's that Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. And the encyclical itself offers in its very structure the way that we, as human persons, can engage social or ecological dilemmas. So the document isn't just about answering the question of climate change or how to get political will or how to deal with thorny economic issues. The document itself is meant to teach us the way through. And he ends by not moving towards what so many environmentalists have been, as I said before, sort of being prophets of doom. He ends with this tremendous confidence and hope in the creativity and the audacity of the human spirit. And when you challenge someone to do something and you let them know that they have what's inside of them to cause that kind of change, to bring about that kind of renovation of the spirit, I think he's inviting all of us to this enormous challenge of climate change or of water use or of shepherding resources well, that is going to be something that is going to transform thinking for generations. We're right up against the encyclical. We've only just begun to feel its impacts. But scientists and theologians, philosophers and economists are beginning to see that they need one another to work and solve these problems. And when I look at a school like Regis and I see the imagination and the creativity of its students, why not have that student be the one that develops a membrane that allows us to use salt water to become potable water for the thirsty of the earth? Why not it be a way that we can develop a kind of seeds that are able to produce food even beyond our wildest dreams? But it's precisely why Pope Francis looks at and says there is a moral issue in producing non-fertile seeds, because non-fertile seeds have one use: consumption. Fertile seeds, like fertile minds here at Regis, can transform generations.
I really liked what you said about people in different fields working together, people in economics, people maybe more focused on spirituality, businessmen of the world. Getting them all to collaborate on this issue, I think, is a very important idea mentioned in the encyclical. I was wondering if you could expand upon how Pope Francis sees this collaboration, and especially with our coming generation, how you see Pope Francis calling our generation to collaborate in between different fields rather than stay separated.
Again, a wonderful question. Oftentimes what people overlook when they're looking at scholarly works or encyclicals is they overlook the bibliography and the power that is contained in a bibliography, because it shows so clearly in the bibliography of Laudato Si how he is bringing reason and Catholic social teaching, philosophical understanding, scientific understanding, economic understanding, and political will. All of those things are revealed in the bibliography of Laudato Si, and you start to understand that what he is doing is bringing into dialogue these heretofore disparate voices. We know from the political climate of our own country here in the US, where a politician makes a statement and they have to stand by that statement because God forbid that they would be seen as waffling or changing their mind. When you know as a student that changing your mind is precisely the pattern of growing and understanding more, right? And that what politicians in defending their constituents or the donors to their political campaigns, right? If they are seen as betraying any of that, well then they're out, right? So the political will to change has to be united with not just politics seen in isolation, but politics understood in collaboration with theologians and science and philosophers, with economists working side by side with biologists and farmers, with social workers who can point out to how to train people, right? Working side by side with a water ecologist, right? And when those gifts are not seen as something that we compete against one another with, but those gifts precisely need to be brought together, then we understand that we're not the center. We don't have the only answer to that problem, but it's precisely in what the earth is showing us with biodiversity and that same kind of interdependence that you see so naturally taught to us in the natural world, right? And saying, oh, unless there's composting that's happening, that soil is not going to get regenerated. A garden is such a beautiful example of an interdependent community. And until we can get that same kind of interdependence that is so clear in the ecological realm, going on in the human realm in particular, with different expertise coming together, we will understand then that the theologian needs the scientist, that the reason needs the revelation, that the biblical tradition needs the literature expert, that the politician needs the economist, that the businessman who has done so well needs those poor persons who have allowed that person to profit to the point where they have. Look what I have done. When we say, look what I have done, it's like we deny that anybody else was a part of our being successful. You ask any student on this campus, they'll be able to tell you who was part. Who was that high school teacher that inspired them to major in history? Who was that coach that inspired them to go on and compete at a college level? They know well, you know well, that you didn't get here by yourself. But somehow we forget that as we go out into the world. Somehow we forget that, and we always want to say, look what we have done, as if we did it all by ourselves.
On behalf of the whole Regis student body, I'd really like to thank you for coming here today, and it's been a blessing to be able to speak with you. I was just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to add that maybe we didn't get to today that you see as important to know.
Bring those dialogues right to Regis's campus. You've got the experts here on campus. Why not have an open table forum between a theologian, an economist, and somebody who teaches business ethics, and say, let's talk about this issue, and I want to hear 3 different voices talk about this one issue. Is water a right or a privilege? What a fantastic question to answer from a business standpoint, from a philosophical, a theological, an economic standpoint, and do in microcosm here on this campus what we need to be doing as a worldwide community. Because when we start to do that here, you will be amazed at how that can gain traction. And then you, as a student, and your fellow students and your classmates can begin to understand that just being an econ major, you need that philosophy major. You need that theology major. You need that business major. Just studying finance, you're not really going to get everything unless you could understand the marketing side of things. We know that intuitively, but what is needed on a worldwide community begin happening just around a small table, a round table here on campus. Don't ever let the creativity diminish that's possible. I had a bunch of students at a university that I'll leave out the name of the university. I asked them, challenged them to come up with a creative way to let the university administration know that they didn't want plastic water bottles on campus anymore. So they, shall we say, borrowed about 500 forks from the cafeteria. The cafeteria was very upset. But they forked the lawn. They filled the lawn outside the president's office with forks stuck into the dirt. And then they inverted a plastic water bottle on every single fork. So the president comes to work that next morning. The cafeteria has no forks. And there are water bottles on forks on the lawn, covering the front of the administration building. The students were speaking up. They were using their voices. They were being creative. They were speaking out for something that had no voice. And that's exactly what we want students in Jesuit schools to do, to use their imaginations to change the unjust structures of our world. And when they forked that lawn in front of the administration building, 2 weeks later, within 2 weeks, they had made some policy changes so they got rid of plastic water bottles. The cafeteria got their forks back, which they were very grateful for. It made the local news, it made the newspapers, and it wasn't just in the college newspaper, it was all over. And it was creativity, it was understanding the kind of interdependence of things, and it was a demonstrable way of showing that what we are trying to teach at schools like Regis, it's not who you are as students, but who you become after you graduate that we are interested in as Jesuit educators and as a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. That kind of creativity changes minds because you help people to see a problem with new eyes. And isn't that what we all need? Thank you for this time. I appreciate it very much. And it's been a pleasure to be here at Regis University.
Thank you, Father Carver.
Take care.